Hello, this is Mr. Kraus, and welcome to my series of brief videos on how to use Google Sheets to make a proper graph. It's not as easy as just clicking on Insert Chart because you'll probably make a mistake. So, very quickly, I hope these are helpful not only for this science class, but into the future if you are making graphs. Before you start to make a graph, you need to think about a few things. What are you trying to show in your graph? What is the goal of your graph? What are you trying to accomplish? What are your variables and your units? Which variables are independent and which variables are dependent? You might have more than one dependent variable, but you only should have one independent variable. What kind of graph do you think it's going to be? A line graph, a bar graph, a pie chart? What are you trying to show? That will be covered a little bit later in videos. For this one, we're just going to set up a line graph with two separate lines. Using Sheets, it is best to put your labels in the top row, in the top rows up here. You label your first column with your independent variable. So I know that I'm going to be using time as an independent variable in this case. Time is not always your independent variable, but in this case it is going to be. So if you want to make your graph easy and come out correctly, you want to make sure it's very important to organize your table correctly. And first, you need to answer the questions that I've laid out before. All right, so I'm going to make a graph showing the movement of this block down a ramp. So I have this simulation here that I'm going to run. It's going to generate some data that I'm going to use and insert into my table here as I go along. You'll notice that I have PE and KE here. I'm going to hide those cells right now because I don't need them for this first part of my graphing. So I'm going to go through and hide those. We'll bring them back later when they're important. So what I am looking for, I'm going to use this simulation to slide a block down a frictionless ramp and an ice ramp. And when I run the simulation, it will collect data in this table for me. I'm measuring time in seconds. I'm measuring height in meters. I'm measuring velocity in meters per second. I have labeled my columns, time in seconds, height in meters, velocity in meters per second. I have labeled these sets of columns here as the steel block, which is 1 kilogram on a frictionless ramp, and the steel block, which is 1 kilogram on an ice ramp. So let's run the simulation, and I will show you what this looks like. So when I click on that, it slides down the ramp, and it generated a data table here. I am then going to reset it, change it to an ice ramp. I will slide it down the ramp, and you'll see the table filling in with data when it makes it down to the bottom. So I can export this data, and I'll spare you all the details of that because it'll be different every time you do things. And it will help you to, and I'll export it and then put it into the Google Sheet and end up with a chart that looks like this. Like I said, eventually we're going to be doing potential energy and kinetic energy, but for right now, those weren't important, so they're put away. Every cell has either the label and the units in it or the number values. So here's my number values. Every 3,000ths of a second, I measured the height and the velocity. Every 3,000ths of a second, I measured the height and the velocity. Here's the height and the velocity for the frictionless ramp with the steel block, and here's the height and the velocity for the steel block on the ice ramp. And you can see it generated lots of data. The reason I used the simulation was to generate lots of data quickly and easily so that I could show you what a proper graph looks like. And again, we're going to show a line graph that is going to have two lines on it for comparing frictionless and ice ramp for this activity. So I wanted to make sure you saw what this looked like here. So I've labeled the columns, I've put in my data, I've made sure everything was where it needed to be. And for a quick recap, before starting to collect the data, I made sure I had thought about a few questions and things I needed to answer and organized the data table that I wanted to use. I laid out my table properly with labels in the column, at the tops of each column in the rows, so that I know exactly what all my data shows. And I made sure that my cells will only have a letter or a number in it. So all of these are number values that Google Sheets knows what to do with. And all of these are letters and labels that will also probably work themselves out as we're making our graph. And I'll run through all of those directions and details when we get there. So I hope that this first video was helpful. The most important thing, and this video is probably one of the most important ones, is that you organize your data correctly. If you did not organize your data correctly, that's probably the biggest reason that your graph comes out wrong or doesn't graph at all, because the data wasn't properly put into a table to create the graph. Again, thank you for watching this, and I hope it helps. And come back for the next videos showing how to actually make the graph and then insert it into a Google Doc for finishing off the process.